I understand.
Ulysses by James Joyce, the quintessential modernist novel, and pretty much universally regarded as the greatest and most definitive work of the 20th century. And I read it, finally. This was a long time coming. I knew that Ulysses was a book I would have to read eventually if I wanted to pass myself off or attempt to as even in an amateur capacity, an authority on literature. I knew I'd have to get Ulysses under my belt at some point, but I put it off and I postponed it. But finally, I have done it. I actually bought my copy of this book in November of last year, I believe, and I told myself then, you're going to read this book next year. 2022 is the year that you will at last read Ulysses. And here we are getting into the latter days of the year, and I decided the time had come. It was time to do it. And I did it. And I have some thoughts. So join me, won't you, as I make my, in all likelihood, rambling and scattershot way through reviewing and perhaps analyzing James Joyce's modernist epic, Ulysses. So I just want to say right now, up front, to preface all that follows, Ulysses is not really my cup of tea. I suspected it wouldn't be long before I ever read it. That's partly why I put it off so long. And that belief, that assessment has only been reinforced now after having read it. Now, that is not at all to say that I cannot appreciate the true genius of it, the craftsmanship, the ingenuity that went into this, that I cannot respect its grandiosity and what a real achievement it is. And that's not at all meant to be dismissive or a slight against the book's evident quality. That's just to say that this kind of thing doesn't really do it for me. But again, that does not mean that I did not appreciate it or even enjoy it. Actually, that's a surprise. I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would. And so I hope that this review can give as impartial of a perspective as I possibly can, even though, again, this just isn't really what I love in literature. But let's get into it, shall we? So, what is Ulysses? Well, if you're watching this video, you probably already know that. It is a modernist, again, the quintessential modernist novel by James Joyce, published in, I believe, the early 1920s. It is the story of Leopold Bloom, an Irishman of Jewish extraction, as he goes about his everyday life over the course of one day in Dublin, Ireland. He is married to an adulterating wife, Molly Bloom, and he interacts with some characters over the course of the thing. But you know, the whole point of this book is not the enthralling nature of its plot, because it can barely even be said to have a plot. This book is occupied almost entirely by the internal thoughts and lives of its characters as they go about their everyday lives. This book also, most people, even the people who haven't read this, or pretty much know that this is meant to be an update and kind of a parallel to Homer's classic epic poem, The Odyssey. Well, I'm here to tell you that is not the case, or at least not the case in plot. While it is true that Ulysses, because the name Ulysses is the Latinized version of the name Odysseus, while it is true that this is something of a reworking of the Odyssey, it is really only so in terms of motifs and certain elements, and definitely not in terms of plot. You should not go into this expecting it to be a one-to-one analogy of the Odyssey, because you will be disappointed. Rather, the various episodes which comprise Ulysses are hinged, each one around usually one certain motif that does correspond to a certain element of the Odyssey. But again, the plot it's unrecognizable. But anyway, this is the update of the hero's journey for the modern world. This book is attempting, I think, or succeeded, I guess, in portraying the small and seemingly mundane activities of day to day life as something grand, a journey home, a homecoming, a grand and not so triumphant return to the homestead or whatnot. This is very much the Odysseus of today, or at least of the 1920s. And it really is remarkable just how modern this book still feels today. It really does. Reading it, if it wasn't for the dated technology and references, it really does feel like something that could be written today. And that really is, again, a remarkable aspect of it. So, um, when I went into this, I was expecting it to be brutal. That's partly why I put this off so long, because Ulysses is notorious in more ways than one, because we have to remember this was the subject of a landmark obscenity trial when it was first published, due to its rather frank and open discussion of basically everything that comprises human existence, the nitty gritty. We have defecation, we have menstruation, we have pretty graphic for the time depictions of sex. We have basically everything that we like to keep the shutters pulled on. But this book hauls it out in the open and says, here it is, here is human life. And while I would never condone censorship, I don't think this book should have, I don't think it's a good thing that this book was ever challenged like it was. I can definitely see why it was, because this book also uses some language that was kind of taboo back then. Um, so I do understand why this was challenged. But this book is also, in addition to that, notorious for its immense difficulty, or purported immense difficulty, because this really is kind of the Mount Everest of hard books. And leading up to this, I really built up an image in my head of what this was going to be like, and it was going to be tough, I thought. There were so many reviews of people that, and so many testimonies of people that said, I tried reading it, I couldn't understand it, I just gave up, I bailed, DNF'd it, not going back, it's just too hard, I just couldn't enjoy it. And you know what? It is hard, but to be perfectly honest, it wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it was going to be, and I was pleasantly surprised by that. Now, that is not at all to, I'm not at all trying to toot my own horn, or I'm not a braggart. I'm not trying to make myself sound smarter than anyone else by saying, well, I mean, what's so hard about it? It's not that hard to read. It was a hard book, absolutely, but I think the level of difficulty that I was anticipating actually exceeded the real level of difficulty that the book possesses, because there were times where, I will be the first to admit, there were times in this where I just lost the plot. I was just reading the words, not with any real sense of what was actually happening. But those times were really few and far between, actually. I would say about 90% of the time in this, I had a pretty clear picture of what was happening, in spite of all the experimentation and word games, I should say, that Joyce employs in this. So I don't think, if there's one thing you can take away from this review, I would say don't be that intimidated by reading this, because I think, I mean, it is hard. It definitely is. It's up there, but it's not unconquerable. And I think the reason a lot of people say that this is so hard is because they probably haven't read anything uh, like this. And while this book is pretty unique, analogs do exist. I read earlier this year and late last year, I read two of Virginia Woolf's biggest books, To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway, and those are also modernist novels. And I think they really, reading something like that that's not really that difficult, but yet still gives you a taste for this style of writing, I think that can really help you going into this by letting you kind of know what to expect. The difference between this book and those books is Virginia Woolf was writing books that were kind of difficult because of the stream of consciousness writing, of which Ulysses employs a great deal. But those books were never intentionally trying to stymie you. James Joyce absolutely did in Ulysses. This book is designed to be confusing and hard to follow. And usually I hate books like that. Usually, I think if an author is just trying to screw with you, I don't really like that. I think if a book is going to be difficult, it should be difficult because it is difficult by necessity, because the subject matter or the things under discussion or the way the story comes together, maybe if it's told in a non chronological way or something, I can get behind that. But when an author just sets out to make a book that's hard to read, I don't really get behind that. But this book was an exception because while this book is definitely an intentional ploy to just alienate you and make this the most ridiculously convoluted and hard to read thing ever, it was playful enough and sly enough and witty enough that I forgave it because this book doesn't really take itself all that seriously. I mean, there are serious parts in it, but overall the tone is kind of it's kind of tongue in cheek a little bit, and I really did respond to that. Again, I actually enjoyed this much more than I thought I would, and that really was a shock because I was anticipating this to be a slog. But of course, first and foremost, we have to talk about the modes of narration employed in this because James Joyce went through a lot of narrative methods in this. And I'm not going to go into it real deep because there are entire books written about how you should approach this book and about how it is written. But uh, the episodes are written in wildly different styles. All of them employ, or almost all of them employ, stream of consciousness to a certain degree. Some of them not so much, and those are the ones that are actually really pretty easy to follow. The episode on the beach where he jerks himself off to the girl lifting her skirt on the beach. That was, and again, these episodes are supposed to have Greek, they have names that correspond to the chapters of the Odyssey. I can't remember which is which, but the fireworks and the masturbation chapter is that's the one that was actually really the easiest to follow. I think it was actually written in a pretty straightforward way. But then you have like towards the end, the second to last episode is written in the form of a catechism, which is like a Q&A kind of way. If you don't know what that is, it's like a religious thing meant to instruct, which is usually just like rapid fire Q&A, and the episode is written like that. And if you can't imagine what that is like, well, I guess you'll just have to read it. And then another episode is written like a play. Um, the episode where they go to the brothel is written in the manner of a play, and that one was the one where I just completely lost all semblance of coherence in this thing. But that was by design. That really was by design because that's the one episode it's just meant to be nonsensical and kind of gibberish, and so I don't feel bad in saying I didn't understand that episode because that was wild. But then some of them are written in manners of style that are meant to be imitative of older modes of narration and older authors. And while it's hard to read, you really have to tip your hat to Joyce because of the level of skill it takes to pull off something like that. Because this book, there is one episode, and again, I can't remember which one, where it traces, like the style that it's written in traces all the way back to like early medieval style writings up through like 16, 1700 style like Daniel Defoe, and then up to the basically contemporary, and that really was something to behold. I'm not going to say that was easy or that was necessarily the most enjoyable part of the book to read, but it really was something to behold because it took a lot to do that. And then certain parts are written in the manner of like a scientific dissertation, lots of medical jargon and anatomical terms and whatnot. And again, maybe not the most fun, but it really is just a feast for the. It's just a lexical feast. There are so many um, passages in here that are just astounding. Now, that's not to say that, again, this is, again, like I said, this is not really my cup of tea. I much prefer prose that is more straightforward and poetic, but that's the thing. The prose in this, there are instances of real beauty, of real, again, poetry to it, where it gets lofty and kind of uh, just really striking. But that's not the name of the game so much with this, and that's partly why this doesn't really scratch the real itch for me. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate it and recognize the enormous ingenuity and effort that went into this. And so, but the themes of this are kind of where it craps out a little bit for me, and I'm going to explain. But the themes of the Odyssey, the Odyssey, the themes of Ulysses, sorry, Freudian slip. The themes of Ulysses are really, I guess, love, Irish identity, Irish national identity, and also it's a highly sympathetic. Uh, it's a highly sympathetic text to the plight of European Jews, in particular Irish Jews, because it really gives a good snapshot of the kind of anti-Semitism that was brewing in early 20th century Europe, which went on to have disastrous and horrific effects later on. We all know what happens. You can kind of, reading this, you can kind of definitely see how that turned into that reading this. But it was a pretty warm book, a pretty human book, and I hear a lot of people say that this is like a really life affirming book, that it's really, it's kind of just this incredibly humanistic book, and it really is. But the thing about it that makes me not love it just as much as I probably would be expected to, as a lot of other people do, is because it ain't that deep. Okay, and a lot of people might disagree with me, but I would say to that, I would say that even Joyce himself said of Ulysses, I believe, he said, went about his writing of it, that my themes are simple. It's merely the method of um, conveyance that is difficult. And that's kind of the problem for me. So Ulysses is a difficult book. I said it's not as hard as I thought it was, but that's not at all to say that it's not hard at all. It was. It is a hard book. Enjoyable and kind of playfully challenging, but still hard. But for me, the payoff just wasn't enough. So, and by that, what I'm saying is this book doesn't really try to make any kind of grand epic statement. It is an epic it's an epic, kind of a parody of an epic, but it doesn't really have a gigantic unifying theme that hangs over it all, except maybe, I guess, like love and the power of love, because that ending is iconic, for one of the most famous endings ever. Yes, I said I will, yes, or whatnot. And that last episode, I just want to say, was chef's kiss. I mean, that Penelope episode that bookended this was perhaps the most intimate portrayal of a human mind that you are likely to encounter in fiction. But the problem that I have with Ulysses is that there isn't really, it's not unified so much by one single statement. The goal that James Joyce was shooting for, I think, in this was really just an incredibly detailed and meticulous and intimate uh, document of human life, everyday human life. And I think he nailed it. I really do think he nailed it. But this book doesn't have as much meat on the bones as I kind of wanted it to. And again, some people may disagree, but I'm going to compare Ulysses to another very difficult book that I read last year, um, that is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And there are a lot of similarities between Ulysses and Moby Dick. For one, they both employ a great deal of narrative experimentation. Um, They both include a large amount of digressions and tangents, and they are both notorious for their difficulty. However, the reason why I love Moby Dick, even though I would say that that was probably harder than this just because of the brutality of having to read all that whale crap. I mean, that was a slog. Like, I'm not gonna lie, that I really do think Moby Dick is probably harder than this because Moby Dick's not as playful. That's like a dry, dead serious book. This book is whimsical and playful, and I can really respond to that. But the difference between Moby Dick and Ulysses is that Moby Dick really did something. And it's not to say that Ulysses didn't. It absolutely did. It's just that what Ulysses does, it's more of an exercise in style and not so much in substance, I think. Whereas Moby Dick is an exercise in style, but it all builds towards something. Okay, so part of the one of the nebulous qualities that people ascribe to the term literary. What makes something literary? What makes a book a work of literary fiction? One of them is that the book generally, most literary books generally wrestle with some big questions. I'm not saying that every book has to be a philosophical manifesto, it doesn't. But a lot of the most famous books that we consider to be literary wrestle with some big questions or big ideas or big themes. Moby Dick did that, and I don't think Ulysses did so much. Now, uh, that is to say, when I got done reading Moby Dick, I really did kind of look at things differently. Because the ultimate meaning of Moby Dick is, or as I took it to be, is that maybe the world in which we live, or the physical reality in which we dwell, is at heart so fundamentally messed up that it is deserving of scorn and criticism. That's something I can really chew on. Ulysses did not seem to have that kind of thing. This book makes a lot of observations about life and about day-to-day activities and about how humans go about their lives and the way that people think and the differences and perspectives of people. But at the end of the day, it did not really show me anything that I had not seen previously. And that is the biggest indictment against this. The return was not big enough for me for what I had to invest in it. And I had to invest a lot. I had to pay this is not a book you want to read like while you're watching television, alternately. This is a book you have to dedicate your utmost attention to, and I did, or at least I tried to, and it just didn't give me as much as I wanted it to. But that's not to say it is without theme at all. Or again, most of its thematic content takes the form of just brief ponderances and observations about different aspects of life. There's also an interesting motif introduced in the first, or nearly the first major part that concerns Leopold Bloom is the word metempsychosis or metempsychosis, which is another word for uh, reincarnation. And it's used as a recurring motif, kind of a byline throughout this work. And I think Joyce was just using this more as a metaphor for how the same kinds of stories come back around and get reused and whatnot, and how the journey of Leopold Bloom through Dublin on one day um, of his life is comparable to the journey of Odysseus back to Ithaca after the Trojan War. I think it continually refers to metempsychosis, and I think it's just like I said, a metaphor for like the way that stories get transmogrified by era and circumstance, but yet it's kind of the same thing. Still, there's like that book that posits that it's like the Booker the Booker's 7 basic plots that posits that there's only 7 kinds. There's really only 7 kinds of stories. I can't recall what exactly they are. Pardon me, but it's kind of like that. And so I think that was just used as kind of a witty metaphor for kind of a reflection on what Ulysses is doing. But because it made reading Ulysses a little bit more fun and a little bit more um, whimsical, I took it as a metaphor of Joy, or not a metaphor, as Joyce slyly telling us that Leopold Bloom actually was Ulysses and that Molly actually is Penelope. I know that's probably not the right interpretation, and I'm aware of that, but it just made it more fun to me to read, to think that it was like genuinely a story about literal reincarnation. It just made it more fun to me to read. But love is kind of, I think, the overarching idea here, if there is one. So Molly Bloom, Leopold's wife, is banging her. She's a concert singer, and she's banging her manager, I guess, named Boylan, on the side, and we don't really know why they're because their marriage is kind of fraying, and we don't really know why at the onset. But when it is revealed at the very end of this book, it recontextualizes everything we've read up until that point, and it makes us reassess whatever judgments we may have made of the characters in the story. So Leopold Bloom has some odd sexual proclivities. He's kind of a voyeur. And he's also kind of a fetishist a little bit. And Molly thinks that he's kind of weird and dirty and skeevy a little bit, and he totally is. But he's lovable kind of because of it. But he's also a willing and kind of a participatory cuckold. And the thing is that when you compare that to Odysseus, which is the character that he is loosely paralleling, it looks kind of dismal, doesn't it? I mean, it's not very heroic. But when you get to the end of that book and it's explained why, because it's explained that they don't really, I mean, they do have sex, but it's not. Yeah, just read the book. And the point is, there's a reason why he is that way and and it's because he loves her, and that's the thing. It's because they had a child who died, and he doesn't want her or him, I guess, to have to go through that again, and so he's kind of punishing himself, and even though it hurts him to see her, in the arms of another man, he's willing to do that, to suffer that kind of self, punishment on her behalf. And so it kind of it makes you question your traditional notions of love, because in our the modern monogamous kind of view of love is that you don't screw around with anybody who you're not married to. But this book, it's oddly touching. It really is oddly touching, and I really did appreciate that, because and this book is not at all judgmental in any capacity. That's the real saving grace of this, is no matter how vile or repugnant the characters of this book may sometimes seem, whether by their viewpoints or the things that they do, none of it is judgmental at all. You are, and that's the best. That's the way best. The best kind of fiction is. It leaves you to make up your own assessment of it. And Ulysses really did fit that bill to a T, because these people do things that conventional morality normally would not really condone, but the book never tells us what to think of them because of that, and I really admired that about it. Because again, when you get to that last chapter, or the very end of the very end of the penultimate episode, going into the Penelope episode, it kind of turns everything on its head a little bit, the way that you're meant to view it. And it really is just, I mean, this book is worth reading if you're down for what this book demands. It's worth reading just to read those last 40 odd pages, because I mean, it doesn't get any more intimate than that. But yeah, this book was just, it's just, it was such an experience. And again, I don't love it, but I don't hate it. And I was fully anticipating hating this when I read it. I was like, this is going to be some uh, needlessly difficult, and it was needlessly difficult, but it was funner than I thought it would be, and it was touching at points. Although that's another criticism, there were parts in this where I thought the dogged experimentalism actually hurt the story because uh, these characters in this book are human. They are as human as it comes. They are painfully, achingly human. But in order to fully understand their psyches, their thought processes, you got to do some work. And while I'm not averse to putting in the work that this book requires, when it comes to the emotional parts of this book, I think it would have done better to just be a little bit more straightforward. Um, there were some times because Stephen Dedalus, who is actually Joyce's protagonist, it's kind of like a it's kind of like what Stephen King does. His books tie together. This ties together with Joyce's earlier novel, portrait of a or the portrait of an artist as a young man, or the artist as a young man, whatever it is. He Stephen Dedalus is the protagonist of that work, and he recurs in this book in a reduced capacity. But the way that the dynamic of his character is set up is something of a surrogate Telemachus to Bloom's Odysseus. Telemachus in the Odyssey is Odysseus' son, and there's this kind of surrogate, or what you really want to be a surrogate father-son kind of relationship between them, and it doesn't come off the way you want it to. It doesn't really come off in an emotionally satisfying way, or at least not to me. And there were just some points in this where I think the book got in its own way. I think the story would have been better served had it not been so look at me showboaty narrative experimentation, and had it just said what needed saying. I think it could have been a little bit more impactful. But as it is, I can still see totally how this book is a lot of people's favorite book, and how a lot of people just endlessly, love to dissect this, because this is definitely the kind of book that you can do that with. And even though, again, it's not really my cup of tea, I won't begrudge anybody their affection for this book, because this is definitely a lovable book. It's just that for me, it just didn't have enough under the hood, I guess, to make it worth it. Because with a book of this caliber of difficulty, when when you're reading something like this, you really do want a good payoff. Like, if I'm going to read something of this level of difficulty, I want it to be something that can really change the way I look at things, like Moby Dick did. Moby Dick really did, because you don't look at, you know, the story of a man chasing a whale for revenge seems absurd. When you start out, you're like, why would anybody be angry at an animal? But the beauty of that book is that by the end of it, you're like, oh, maybe there's more to what that whale. I mean, maybe again, the world in which we live is so direly flawed that that's actually not beyond reason to feel that way. That it really did make me look at things differently, and that's why I love Moby Dick. Even though it was arguably more difficult than this, I got more out of it than this, because this book, I think, is exercise more in style than substance. And while I can appreciate this style, at the end of the day, it just didn't do enough for me. So I guess to conclude, I guess there's more that I could go on about Ulysses. I mean, there are books probably longer than this book, and this book was a brick. It was 783 pages. There are books probably longer than that have been written about this book and how to dissect it. So, of course, I could go on at length, but I'm trying to not ramble too much. But so to conclude, do I agree with the assessment of Ulysses. Do I concur that this book is the greatest of the 20th century? Yes and no. In terms of style, in terms of how it's written, absolutely. Yes. This is without doubt one of, or perhaps the most imitated and copied books that you will ever see. Like, there are entire books that come out, like that book that came out a couple years ago or last year or so called Ducks Newburyport. I haven't read it, but it sounds like that book pretty much owes its entire existence to this, because this book laid a template, and this is kind of a bar that a lot of authors have been really struggling to match ever since it came out. And so, yeah, in terms of style, just because of how copied this book is and how much it is imitated and emulated, absolutely, yes, this is the number one of the 20th century. However, in terms of content, in terms of subject matter, in terms of what the book actually says, hell no. There are way better books to read than this. If you're in the mood just to see a book told, to read a story told in the most kind of just ridiculously experimental, push it to the boundaries kind of way, this is your thing right here. But if you just want to read a story that that has, I mean, I just think there's better books out there in terms of like content and subject matter and thematic material and subtext. This book has some stuff, but it really didn't match up, to me at least, with the level of input that you're going to have to do on your part to get there. So, but overall, I really did actually like this more than I thought I would. So to rate Ulysses, now that's a hard, that's a tall order. Objectively, I guess this is an A plus work. I think this book succeeded at pretty much everything it set out to do. It's just that what it ultimately did, I don't think all of it was really worth doing. But I think it met the goals that it set for itself, that Joyce set when he started writing this. So yeah, it's objectively an A plus work. In terms of my own personal reaction to it, I give it like a C, maybe a C plus. No, or yeah, probably just a C. It was good. I actually enjoyed it and kind of liked it more than I thought I would. But at the end of the day, it ain't the greatest book I've ever read. But yeah, I have read it now, and that is the important thing, because now I have bragging rights. Now I can say, hell yeah, I read Ulysses. Like, yeah, Ulysses, I read that. But yeah, I read it. I met my own challenge. I kept my promise to myself, and I am happy. So, Ulysses by James Joyce. Have you read Ulysses? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I have said about it here today. If you have not read Ulysses, I'm not going to recommend this. You will know whether this is something that you want to tackle or whether you're up to tackling. So I'm not going to recommend it or not recommend it one way or the other. If it sounds like something, I mean, if you're ready to climb that mountain, do it. If you're not, I don't think you're going to be too greatly benighted by abstaining. So it's up to you. I don't really care either way. I read it, and that's all that matters to me. So, yeah, and as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. I would greatly appreciate it. And until next time, peace.